In this tutorial, we will expand our login action in order to authorize the administrators that will be logging into our insurance agent administration application. We will do this through using an authentication service and storing the authenticated users in the session. These are the steps we will take to secure our existing login action. First, we will reuse our previous project. Then we will create an administrator class for all the valid administrators. Then we will create an administrator service to authenticate our administrators. For now, we'll just use an in-memory database. After that, we will expand the login action to use the administrator service to authenticate our login. Then we will actually change our validation to use Struts Validation in our login.jsp and in our login action. We will also change our login action to store the valid logged in administrator in a session object. Then we will add a global interceptor that will check for a valid administrator in the session. So we'll start by renaming our project to RUD version 4. Now we will do a global text search to see if Eclipse missed any after renaming. It looks like we've got all of them. So now we can do a Maven update and make sure it still runs. And everything looks good there. Okay, next up, we are going to add the administrator POJO. So we'll create a new package. And we'll create the administrator class inside the package. In the administrator class, we store the name and password. We'll let Eclipse generate our getters and setters for us. We will also let Eclipse generate the toString. Now we will add the administrator service class, pasting it in, and as you can see, it is a static in-memory database that will only contain one administrator with the name of insurance and the password of admin. And it has an authenticate administrator method, which will get the valid administrator name and then check if it has a valid password. Now we're going to go back to our login action and expand that to make use of our new administrator service. So we're going to add a session object map. And we're going to add a logger to help with debugging and logging. And this is how we'll use the authentication service. So what we do here is we use the administrator service to pass in the username and password. The service then checks for a valid username and password against its in-memory database. And if it finds one, it returns a valid administrator object, which we store in our session map with our key value of administrator. And if it does not find a valid administrator, we get a returned null object, and then we return the user to the login input screen. So let's just have a look at the authenticate method. So this is the username and password, gets the administrator object using the username key in the in-memory administrator database, and then it checks if the password is valid. And if it's valid, it returns us with a new administrator object. Now for our next step, we'll go back to our login action. In our login action, we are going to use Struts Validation. We will do that by overriding the action support validate method with the help of Eclipse. So we'll right-click, click Source, Override Implement Methods, and here it gives us all the action support methods we can override. Down here we have Validate, click OK. It put the validate method right down here at the bottom, so we'll move it up. So now we're gonna replace the logic in our isInvalid method with validation in our struts validate method. So we can remove this code. And I'll paste in the validation code. So essentially it's the same kind of logic we had with the isValidate, except now that it uses the framework, calls the add field error method. And if we use Eclipse to look at that, we see that this method also comes with the action support class that our login action extends. Now essentially what this method does, it adds an error message to the input field of username, and here it adds an error message of password is required to the password field. And now where are these fields? Well, obviously they're on the login.jsp, so let's have a look at them. We use the key value of username and the key value of password. Now in order for these error messages to show up next to these input field, we need to import the struts tag library, which we'll do inside of the head tag. Another thing to note now is that this validation logic is no longer part of the execute method. It actually uses one of the struts2 built-in interceptors to validate our input value for username and password. So let's do a Maven update and a Maven clean package and try to run this and see if our validation changes worked. It looks like our validation errors showed up. That was provided for us out of the box by the Struts framework, which is good. Now it looks like we got a null pointer exception. So let's have a look here. It looks like it's line 49 on session put and the administrator key value pair. So let's do a debug and see what is the problem. Well, that got us the user not valid. So we have a valid administrator object. We have a valid administrator key string. We don't have the session value, which means that we probably did not initialize our session object. So let's go ahead and change our code to do that. Yeah, we don't set it anywhere in our action, so let's see what Struts provides for us. So in order to have Struts support the setting of the session, we're going to have to implement session aware interface. adding the unimplemented methods, which is set session, where we actually have to set our session object. Now let's do a Maven update and build and see if we still get a null error in our session object. Let's run it in debug mode again. Insurance admin. Switch to our debug view. And now we have the session object populated. And we have the welcome administrator page showing up. So we managed to resolve the null pointer exception. Now it is on to our final step. We will now create an authentication interceptor that will check that there is a valid administrator stored in our global session object. We will add this interceptor to our Struts XML configuration to ensure that all incoming web traffic to our Insurance Agent Administration application will be checked for a valid administrator in our session object. And if it's not found, then the user will be redirected to the login page. So let's go to our XML configuration. And here we will add our login interceptor definition. Here we've got the name and the package. So that means we've got to add that interceptor in our utils package. So I'll paste it in. It also makes use of an administrator aware interface. And all this interface does, it allows us to add set administrator method implementations on the rest of our actions down the road. So let's have a look at the logic here. Got the intercept method. It gets the action invocation session object. It then checks if there is a administrator object inside the session. If there is not, it will redirect the user to the login action. If it finds one, it will set the administrator for the action if it implements an administrator aware interface, and it will continue to invoke the action. So let's do a final Maven update and Maven clean package and run it. And that looks good. And that concludes our login and authentication tutorial.